She repeated the same question relentlessly until Karoline had enough. What happened next left everyone in the room stunned. The chamber was filled to capacity, with a line of cameras positioned along the back wall, their lenses focused on the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, composed and self-assured. She was accustomed to challenging audiences, but today felt different. The atmosphere in the Washington, D.C. briefing room was dense with anticipation and unspoken tension humming beneath the surface. She adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming content." Hands immediately shot up across the room, journalists eager for a headline, anxious to get their questions in first. Karoline gestured toward a familiar face, a reporter from a major network who inquired about the administration's latest tax cut policy. She responded smoothly, delivering the kind of well-rehearsed answer that came with the position. Then another question, a follow-up on education reform. Karoline addressed it without hesitation. She had done this countless times before. Stand firm, control the narrative, and navigate the press like a seasoned professional. But that's when it happened. A voice cut through the room, sharper than the rest. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." It was her, the liberal reporter. Karoline knew her well. Always aggressive, always looking to push the conversation into controversy. She was seated near the front, leaning forward with a smirk, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. Karoline maintained her composure. "Go ahead." The reporter didn't waste a second. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities?" "Because the data suggests," Karoline raised a hand. "I've answered that question before. The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss the specifics of today's topic, I'm happy to continue." A few murmurs rippled through the room, but the reporter wasn't finished. She leaned in further. "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Karoline interrupted, her tone firm but controlled. She glanced at the other journalists, signaling that she was ready to move on. For a moment, the room seemed to settle, a brief pause as if everything might return to normal. But then, "I just don't see why you're avoiding it," the reporter pressed, her voice cutting through the space. "It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The temperature in the room shifted. Other reporters exchanged glances. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable. No one liked a press conference turning into a showdown, but that's exactly what was happening. Karoline exhaled slowly. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer. If not, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. She leaned even closer to the microphone. "So that's a no comment?" The energy in the room tightened, the weight of the moment settling on everyone's shoulders. It was clear this wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was becoming a spectacle. A hush fell over the room. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, the kind of silence that wasn't passive but waiting, like an elastic band stretched just before it snapped. Karoline adjusted her stance, placing both hands on the podium. "I've answered your question. I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist in the back, but before they could speak, the same voice cut through again. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face. Not much, just a brief tightening around the eyes, but enough for those paying attention to catch it. She wasn't new to this. She knew reporters had a job to do, but there was a difference between pressing for accountability and turning an event into a personal stage. And right now it was clear which one this was. A few cameras panned from Karoline to the reporter, catching every shift in body language, every subtle movement that could be spun into a headline. Karoline inhaled through her nose. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." The reporter smirked. "Sure, new question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A few quiet gasps. Some reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the moment turning into something bigger. Karoline gave a measured blink, the only sign that the remark had landed. Her grip on the podium tightened for a second before she let go, exhaling just slightly. She smiled, but not the warm, diplomatic kind. This was a different kind of smile, one that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. Transparency? That's exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency. It's about theatrics. The words hung in the air. The reporter's smirk faltered just a little. Another journalist, this one seated closer to the back, cleared his throat. "Karoline, if I could—" But again, the same voice interrupted. "So you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics? The American people deserve real answers." The cameras caught everything. The slight tilt of Karoline's head, the way the other journalists shifted in their seats, some clearly frustrated that the event had been hijacked. A veteran journalist, someone who had been covering politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." But the reporter didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more likely it was to go viral. A confrontation like this, it was gold for social media. Karoline saw it too. She had a choice: engage and give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She sighed, finally looking towards security at the side of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The shift in her gaze was enough. The room tensed again. Everyone knew what that meant. This was no longer just an argument. It was about to escalate. The air in the room felt heavier now. No one was speaking, but the tension was thick enough to hold everyone in place. Karoline could see it, the way some of the journalists avoided eye contact, others gripping their pens just a little tighter. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The reporter, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an unwavering posture, didn't move. She was still leaning forward, pen resting against her notepad, a quiet smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't here to ask a question. She was here to make a point. Karoline straightened. "I'll say this one more time. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it. But I'm not going to stand here and engage in bad faith arguments." The reporter chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Bad faith, Karoline? I'm doing my job. Isn't that what a free press is for?" Karoline didn't blink. A free press is about holding people accountable. What you're doing is trying to turn this into a spectacle. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some of the journalists stole quick glances at each other, sensing the shift. The back and forth was no longer about policy. It was something else now. The reporter tapped her pen once on the table. "So just to be clear," Karoline knew what was coming before she even said it. "Are you refusing to answer because you can't, or because you don't want to?" Silence. A few reporters inhaled sharply, bracing for what came next. Karoline exhaled, measuring her response. "I am refusing to play a game. This press conference is not about you." The smirk on the reporter's face flickered just for a moment. Then she leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. "Right, because expecting transparency is a game." This time it wasn't just a murmur. A few journalists whispered to each other. Others glanced toward Karoline, waiting to see how she would handle this. Karoline had dealt with difficult reporters before, but this was something different. This wasn't about policy. It was about control, about who could steer the conversation. She adjusted the microphone slightly, taking a step back from the podium. "I think we're done here." The words sent a shock wave through the room. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me?" Karoline didn't flinch. "You've made it clear you're not interested in an actual discussion. You're looking for a headline. If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to, but I won't be answering any more of your questions." The reporter let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "So, silencing the press? Got it." Caroline's jaw tightened. She knew that was coming. She knew exactly how this would be spun the second the cameras went off. But she also knew there was no winning with someone like this. She glanced toward security, a subtle, wordless signal, and just like that, everything changed. People shifted in their seats. The energy in the room snapped from tense anticipation to full-blown confrontation. It was no longer just an argument. It was about to become something much bigger. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Journalists weren't just watching now. They were recording every second, every movement, waiting to see how far this would go. The hum of camera shutters clicking filled the space, capturing the exact moment Karoline glanced at security. The reporter noticed it too. Her smirk disappeared. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, her voice lower now, but sharp enough to slice through the room. Karoline didn't answer. A uniformed officer stationed by the door took a slow step forward. He didn't need to say anything. The meaning was clear. The reporter had two options: de-escalate or double down. She chose the latter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Then louder so the cameras would catch it. "So much for freedom of the press, huh?" Karoline remained still. Freedom of the press doesn't mean hijacking a press conference. The reporter let out a dry laugh, looking around the room as if inviting the other journalists to agree with her. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few scribbled notes, but no one spoke. The security officer took another step. For a split second, the reporter hesitated. She could stand her ground, make them physically remove her. That would be a viral moment. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative another way. Karoline watched as the decision played out behind the reporter's eyes. Then slowly, the woman reached for her notepad. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. "This is a disgrace," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be picked up by the mics. Then one final jab before she turned toward the exit. "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. The door closed behind the reporter, and just like that, it was over. Or at least it should have been. The silence that followed was thick. No one sure what to do next. The cameras were still rolling. Some journalists kept their eyes down, pretending to scribble notes. Others just stared. Then from the back of the room, a voice. "Karoline, do you think this was the right decision?" She turned her gaze toward the journalist who had spoken. "I think it was necessary." Another voice. "You don't think this will backfire?" She knew it would. She knew by the time she left this room, the internet would already be flooded with clips. She could already see the headlines. "Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions." Did it matter? She straightened. "We're here to have discussions, not disruptions. If anyone else has real questions, I'm happy to answer them." A beat of hesitation. Then slowly, a hand went up. The press conference continued. But the real storm, it was just beginning. Within minutes, the footage would spread like wildfire, and by the time Karoline left the podium, her name would already be trending. Media integrity is a fragile thing in an era where clicks matter more than context. The line between journalism and activism is blurrier than ever. The real question isn't whether Karoline was right or wrong, it's whether we as a society value truth enough to recognize when we're being manipulated. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comments below, and if you want more content like this, hit that subscribe button.